load it into our project like normal code. So let's save, and let's give this a try. So this code creates a function called hello. So let's try running this hello function in our project. We'll go to checkout.js, and then scroll to the top. And then here, let's just run the function hello. So hello and brackets, and save. Now, if we go back to our project, go to the checkout page, and check the console, right-click, inspect, and the console, you'll see that it displayed the message hello. So that's how an external library works. It's just code that is outside of our project. And we can load this code using a script tag like this. We just give it the URL of where this code is located. So there's two things you might be wondering about. How can we put this script tag at the top? So generally, we load external libraries first, and then we can use the library in our own code below. And the second thing is, how do you put code on the internet like this? To learn this, you can check out my video on how to put a website on the internet. It'll show you how to put any file like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files onto a website like this. Next, let's talk about why we use external libraries. External libraries let us share code. Instead of writing all the code ourselves, we can use code that other people wrote, and this helps us save time and avoid duplicating work. Right now, we're loading a very simple library, so let's load a more complex library to show how we can save a lot of time and work. Let's go back to our project and go to the checkout page. Here, we have a section for choosing a delivery option for this product. And you'll notice that each option has a date. So this is the date that the product should be delivered by. So the way this works is that the cheapest option here takes 7 days to deliver. The $4.99 option takes 3 days to deliver, and the $9.99 option takes 1 day to deliver. So to get these dates here, we need to do 3 things. First, we need to somehow get today's date in our JavaScript. Number 2, we need to do calculations with the date, such as add 7 days or add 3 days. And number 3, we need to display the date in an easy-to-read format like this. Now, we could try to figure out how to do this ourselves by writing our own code, but this is going to be a lot of work. Instead, we can use an external library to help us work with dates. So in this project, we're going to use an external library called day.js. This is a popular library that helps us work with dates. So first, let's load day.js into our project. We're going to go to the video description, and we'll click this link. For the day.js external library. And when the page opens, you'll see a bunch of random code here. Now you might think that this is some special code, but this is actually just regular JavaScript code that has been compressed. So basically all the extra spaces have been removed and the variable names have been shortened to 1 letter. We compress JavaScript code like this because we need to load this code from the internet into our project. By compressing it, it makes this code smaller, so it will load into our project faster. So this compression process is called minification, or we minify the code. Okay, so this is the code for the external library day.js. Now let's load this code into our project. We'll go back to our code, and then go to checkout.html, and then here we're going to add another script tag, less than script, and the source attribute. And then here, we're going to give it the URL of the code we want to load. So let's go back to the code for day.js, and then up here, we're going to right-click and copy this URL, and then inside our code, in the source attribute, we're going to right-click and paste the URL, and save. So again, this will take all the code that's located on this page and then load it into our project. Now let's give it a try. The day.js external library creates a function called day.js. So we'll go to checkout.js, and then at the top, we're going to run the day.js function and brackets. Now make sure this is all lowercase, because that's the name that the library used. So now let's actually console.log the result of this function. Console.log and save. And we'll go back to our project. In the checkout page, we're going to check our console. And you'll see that the day.js function gives us an object. And this object represents the current date and time. So we know that day.js is working. And that's it. We successfully loaded the day.js external library into our project. Now let's learn how to use day.js. External libraries usually have a documentation page that shows us how to use the library. We can find the documentation page by searching on Google the library name like day.js and then documentation, or we can ask an AI tool how to use the library. To make things easier in this video, I'm going to show you the features that we need, and you can go through the documentation later if you want. So earlier we said we needed to do 3 things with a date. First, we want to get today's date. Number 2, we want to do calculations with the date. And number 3, we want to display the date in an easy-to-read format. Day.js helps us do all of these things. So first, let's use day.js to get today's date. According to the documentation, to get the current date and time, we can just use the day.js function, like this. So if we go back to our code, that's what we have here. We call day.js, and it gives us an object that represents the current date and time. The second thing we need to do is to do calculations with the date. So for the delivery options here, we need to calculate today's date plus 7 days, or today's date plus 3 days. So again, the day.js library can help us do this. So let's go back to our console and look at the object that we get back from day.js. So this object represents today's date and time. And this object also has a method called add, which adds a certain amount of time to this date. So this is what we need for the project to calculate these dates here. Let's go to our code. And first, let's save this result in a variable. So we're going to remove this and create a variable const today equals day.js. And then down here, we're going to use the add method. So we'll type today.add and brackets. Now the add method takes 2 parameters. The first one is the number of time that we want to add. So if we want to add 7 days, we're going to type 7. And then the second parameter is the length of time that we want to add. So if we want to add 7 days, we're going to give it a string days. So this will add 7 days to today's date. So let's save this result in a variable. Const delivery date equals this result, and we'll console.log it to make sure it's working correctly. Console.log the delivery date and save. Now if we go back to our project and open the console, it will give us an object that represents 7 days after today, or 7 days after when you're watching this video. So that's how we use day.js to do calculations with the date. It gives us methods like add to add a certain amount of time to the date. Finally, we're going to use day.js to display this date in an easy-to-read format like this. So according to the documentation, this date object has another method called .format, which will display the date in an easy-to-read format. So let's go back to our code, and we'll remove the console.log, and we'll type delivery date dot format. And then inside these brackets, we're going to give this method a string. So this string tells day.js what kind of format we want for the date. So in the documentation, it has a table showing us some special characters we can put into this string. For example, if we want to show the day of the week, like Monday or Tuesday, we can type 4 Ds into the string. And this will give us a string where this text is replaced by the actual day of the week. If we want to add a comma and a space to this format, we can just add a comma and space, and this will show up directly in the result. Now let's say that after this, we want to show the month. According to the documentation, to show the month, we can type 4 capital M's. And it will replace this with the month. And finally, we'll type a space. And according to the documentation, if we want to insert the day of the month into the string, we can type a capital D. So this method takes this date and converts it into a string with this format. So now let's console.log this to see what it looks like. Well, console.log and brackets and save, and then go into our project and open the console. And now you should see the date 7 days after today, but displayed in an easy to read format. So that's how we use the day.js external library to help us work with dates. And as you can see, it saves us a lot of time and work. We don't have to figure out how to work with dates ourselves. We can just use someone else's code to solve this problem. So a best practice in programming is when we need to do something complicated, try to find an external library first before writing the code ourselves. To find external libraries, we can search in Google, JavaScript, and then what kind of library we're looking for, like date library. We can also use an AI tool to help us find external libraries. Next, we're going to learn how to use external libraries and JavaScript modules together. Right now, if we look at our code and go to checkout.html, we're loading these libraries using script tags. The problem with script tags is that it runs this code directly on the page, and this might cause naming conflicts. For example, the hello library creates a function called hello. So if something else is called hello in any of our other code, it might cause a naming conflict. A better way to load external libraries is to use JavaScript modules, because a module will contain this code inside a file, and any variables that are created inside the file will not conflict with anything outside of the file. To use external libraries and JavaScript modules together, we're going to use a special version of the library called an ESM version. ESM stands for ECMAScript modules. ECMAScript is just another name for JavaScript. So the ESM version of a library is just a version that works with JavaScript modules. So let's do an example. We're going to go to the video description, and we're going to open the ESM version of hello.js. So you can see that it's the exact same code as before. We're creating a function called hello, except this time I just added the word export in front of function. So this turns the library into an ESM version, and now it will work with JavaScript modules. So let's use the ESM version in our code. We're going to go back to our code, and we're not going to use script tags to load this anymore. So let's delete this and save. And then in checkout.js, at the top, we're going to use an import to import this function into our code. So we'll type import, curly brackets, we'll import the function hello, and we're going to import it from a string, and then this time, instead of giving it a file path like before, we're going to give it a URL that contains our code. So on the web page, we're going to right-click and copy the URL at the top, and then inside our code, in here, we're going to right-click and paste. So this import works the same way as before. except now the code is coming from the internet rather than one of our files. So let's save and then go back to our project and check the console. And you can see that everything is still working. So that's how we use external libraries and JavaScript modules together. We just load the ESM version of the library, and we use import as normal, except this time we're importing from code that is on the internet. Next, let's use Day.js with JavaScript modules. To do that, we're going to load the ESM version of Day.js. So we're going to go to the video description and click this link for the Day.js ESM version. And now we're going to load this code into our project. So let's go back into our code. And first, let's open checkout.html. And we're going to remove the script tag because we're going to load this with JavaScript modules. So let's save and then go into checkout.js. And then at the top, we're going to import from the Day.js ESM version. So we'll import, and we're going to use a slightly different syntax. We're just going to type Day.js without the curly brackets. And then we'll type from a string, and we're going to give it the URL that contains the code. So we'll go to our browser and then click the URL at the top. We're going to right-click, copy, and then in our code, inside these quotes, right-click and paste. And save. So now let's open our project and take a look at the console to make sure it works. So we'll right-click, inspect the console, and everything is still working. So that's how we use the Day.js external library with JavaScript modules. So before we continue, we're going to learn about this new syntax that we used here. So this syntax is called a default export. A default export is another way of exporting something from a file. We can use it when we only want to export one thing from a file. And it makes the syntax a little bit cleaner because we don't have to type the curly brackets. So let's do an example of a default export to see how it works. We're going to open the utils folder and open money.js. And at the bottom, we're going to create a default export by typing export default, and then whatever we want to export. So let's say we want to export this function here. So we just type the name of the function, format currency, and save. And now when we import this, we can just import the name without the curly brackets. So the syntax is a little bit cleaner. Now each file can only have one default export. So if we only want to export one thing from a file, this is another syntax that we can use. So some people like using default exports because they feel that exporting only one thing from a file makes the code cleaner. However, in your own code, it's up to you which version of export you want to use. Let's go back to checkout.js. And then here, the Day.js library only exports one thing, which is the Day.js function. So they chose to use a default export instead of a normal export that we were using before. By the way, the syntax up here with the curly brackets is called a named export. So when we use external libraries in the future, some libraries will use named exports like this, and other libraries will use a default export like this. So it's useful to know both syntaxes. So that's how we use external libraries and JavaScript modules together. We just import from the ESM version of the library. Now keep in mind that not every library has an ESM version. So for some libraries, we still have to use a script tag. Okay, now that we learned external libraries, let's do some practical examples. We're going to go back to the checkout page, and we're going to use Day.js to create the delivery options here. So the way this works is that we can select one of 3 delivery options. When we click an option, it should change the delivery date up here, and it should change the prices on the right side. So let's get started. As always, we're going to do 3 steps. First, we're going to save the data, and then we're going to generate the HTML. And finally, we're going to make it interactive. So first, what data do we need to save for this section? Well, each delivery option has a delivery time, like 7 days or 3 days. And each option also has a price. So right now, here's what our cart looks like. Now we could save the delivery option details inside the cart like this. However, notice that this data gets duplicated for each product in the cart. Instead, we're going to save the delivery options separately, and then just save an ID that points to the delivery option. As a reminder, this technique is called normalizing the data. We save the delivery options separately, and then we just save an ID that points to the full delivery option. So let's create the data for the delivery options. We'll go into our code, and then in the data folder, let's create a new file for this. And we're going to name this file delivery options.js and press enter. And in here, we'll create a list of delivery options that we can pick from. We'll create a variable const delivery options equals an array because we want a list. And then each delivery option is going to have multiple values, like the time to deliver as well as the price. So we're going to make each of them an object to group these values together. So I'm going to rearrange my windows here so that we can see the data that we're trying to save. And we can actually close these tabs for now. So here, let's save the data for the first delivery option. First, let's give it an ID property, because as we mentioned, we're going to save the ID in the cart, and then we're going to use that ID to get the full delivery option here. So to keep things simple, let's just give it a string and an ID of 1. And then we're going to give it another property, and we're going to save the delivery time. So for the first option, it's going to take 7 days to deliver. So let's create a property delivery days, colon, 7, and comma, and we're also going to save the price. So this one is free, so we're going to save the price, cents, and 0. Remember that a best practice when calculating money is to save it in cents. And next, let's save the data for the second delivery option here. We'll type a comma and another object, and let's give it an ID of 2 this time. And this one is going to take 3 days to deliver. So we'll type delivery days, colon 3, and we'll give it a price, cents, and this one is $4.99, so $4.99. And then finally, we're going to save the data for the third delivery option, comma, another object, ID of 3, and this one is going to take 1 day to deliver. So we'll type delivery days, colon 1, comma, and the price cents is $9.99. So price cents, $9.99, and save. So now that we've created our delivery options, for each product in the cart, we're going to save the ID of the delivery option that's selected. So for example, here we selected the first option. We're going to save an ID of 1 in our cart. So let's go back into our code, and we're going to open the cart. So here in the default cart, we're going to save the delivery option ID, colon, and let's say that the first product selected the first delivery option. So we're going to save the ID 1. And then for the second product, we're also going to save a delivery option ID, colon, and then let's say that for the second product, we chose the second delivery option here. So here, we're going to give it an ID of 2. Next, when we add a product to the cart, we also need to give it a delivery option ID. So if we scroll down to the add to cart function, here we're adding a product to the cart. So when we add a new product, we also want to give it a delivery option ID. So we'll type delivery option ID colon. And for new products, let's give it a default delivery option of 1. So for new products, they'll select the first one. And now let's save. And lastly, we might have a cart that is saved in local storage. So we'll need to add the delivery option ID to local storage as well. But to keep things simple, let's just do a shortcut. We're going to delete the cart in local storage, and then it will go back to using this default value, which has the delivery option IDs. So to delete the cart from local storage, we're going to go into our page and open the console, right-click, inspect the console, and we're going to type local storage dot remove item brackets and the cart, and press enter. So this will erase the cart from local storage, and it will use those default values. So now let's go to our page and refresh, and it should be using the default cart. So that's how we save the data for the delivery options. By the way, in the rest of this course, if you get an error in your project, but your code looks correct, you may have some bad data saved in local storage. To fix this, you can try running localstorage.clear in your console to remove everything from local storage, and then refresh the page. The next step is to generate the HTML. First, let's find the HTML for the delivery options here. To do that, we can right-click this part of the page and inspect, and this will give us the HTML for this part. So we're going to find the element that represents this part of the page, and that's this one right here. It's a div with the class delivery-options. And to find this in our code, we're going to search for this class. So let's go back to our code, and then we're going to open checkout.js, which is right here. And we'll press Control F or Command F to find code, and we're going to look for the class delivery-options. And it will give us this code right here. So this is the HTML for the delivery options. So now instead of writing this HTML directly, we're going to generate this with JavaScript. To keep our code organized, let's create a function for generating this HTML. We'll scroll to the bottom, and then here we'll create a function, and let's call it delivery options HTML, brackets and curly brackets. And now inside here, we're going to do 3 steps. First, we're going to loop through the delivery options we created earlier. And then for each option, we're going to generate some HTML. And then finally, we're going to combine all the HTML together. So first, let's import the delivery options at the top. So we'll scroll up, and we're going to import curly brackets from quotes, and we're going to locate the delivery options file, which is inside the data folder. So first we need to get out of the scripts folder. We'll type .. and then go into the data folder /delivery options.js. And we're going to import the delivery options. Now, one thing I forgot to do is that inside these delivery options, we need to make sure that we export this variable. So we're going to type export and save. And we'll go back to checkout.js. And then here, we're going to loop through the delivery options below. So we'll scroll back down to this new function and type delivery options dot for each, brackets and a function inside. And we'll name the parameter delivery option. So for each delivery option, we're going to generate some HTML. So let's use a template string to save the HTML. And then we're going to scroll up, and we're going to find the class delivery-option. So this is the HTML for one delivery option. So we're just going to copy this HTML into our JavaScript below. So we'll right click, copy, and then down here, inside the string, give some new lines, and right click and paste. And if we need to reformat, we can select these lines and press tab. Okay, now when we're generating the HTML, instead of using the same date every time, we're going to calculate the date using day.js and then insert it into here. To calculate the date, we're going to get today's date first using day.js. So up here, let's create a variable const today equals, and according to the documentation, to get today's date, we can just call the day.js function. So we'll type day.js and brackets. Next, each delivery option takes a certain amount of days to deliver. So we need to add that to today's date. To do that, we have a method called .add. So below this, let's create a variable to save the result. Const delivery date equals today dot add brackets, and we're going to give it two parameters. The first parameter is how many days we want to add, and this is saved in the delivery option. So here we'll give it the delivery option dot delivery days, comma, and then we'll give it the length of time we want to add, which is a string days. Now that we calculated the correct delivery date, we need to display it in an easy-to-read format. And again, day.js has a method called format that lets us do this. So below, let's create a variable const, and we'll call it date string, and make it equal to delivery date dot format brackets, and we'll give it a string. So the format we want is we want to insert the day of the week. So according to the documentation, we can use 4 Ds and then a comma and a space, and then we want to insert the month. And according to the documentation, that's 4 capital M's. And finally, we're going to insert the day of month, which is capital D. So now that we calculated this date string, we're going to insert it into the HTML instead of using this same date every time. So we'll remove this and then insert the date string. Next, let's insert the price because it's going to be different prices every time. So at the top, let's create a variable const, and we'll call it price string and make it equals. And remember, each delivery option has a property price cents. So if the price cents is 0, we want to display the text free. If the price cents is not 0, we want to display the price as dollars with a dash. So to do that, let's practice using a ternary operator. So first, we'll check if the price cents is 0. So we'll type delivery option dot price cents is triple equals to 0. And then we'll type a new line and question mark, and also a new line and colon. So remember, the way that a ternary operator works is that if the first part returns true, the value is whatever is after this question mark. If the first part is false, then the value is whatever is after the colon. So it's sort of like an if statement, except we can save the result in a variable. So if the price cents is 0, that means it's free. So we want to display the text free. So we'll create a string free. And if the price cents is not 0, we want to display the price as dollars. So here, we're going to type a template string, a $sign, and we're going to insert the price cents as dollars. So here we'll type delivery option dot price cents. And to display this as dollars, we already have a function for this called format currency. So at the front, we're just going to type format currency, open bracket, and close bracket. And then at the end, let's add a dash. So here we'll add space and dash and semicolon. So that's how we create the price string for each delivery option. So now let's substitute this into the HTML. So we'll remove this and substitute the price string and save. So now, instead of using the same values every time, we're substituting the values into the HTML. Finally, let's combine all this HTML together. So we're going to scroll up to the top, and outside of this loop, we're going to create a variable to save the result. So let HTML equals empty string to start, and then every time we loop through, we're going to add this HTML to this result. So here, we're going to type HTML plus equals. And finally, after we've created this HTML, we're going to return it from this function. So at the bottom, we're just going to return the HTML and save. Now that we generated the HTML for the delivery options, let's insert this into the HTML above. So instead of creating this HTML directly, we're going to delete it. And then here, we're going to insert, and we're going to run this function to generate it. So here, we're going to type delivery options HTML and brackets. Now, before we save, one thing that we're missing in this function is that if we scroll down, here we're using a variable called matching product. But this variable is not accessible inside this function. So let's actually pass the matching product into here. So at the top, we're going to add a parameter, matching product. And then when we call this function up here, we're going to pass in the matching product. So matching product. So now let's save and check our page. And now we're generating the HTML for these delivery options. And you'll notice that your delivery dates here will be based on today's date, or when you're watching this video. So this will be 7 days after today, or 7 days after when you're watching this video. This will be 3 days after today, or 3 days after when you're watching this video. And this will be 1 day after today. Now, one thing we need to fix here is that these selectors are empty. However, we want the delivery option that is saved in the cart to be checked. To do that, let's go back to our code. And in order to make one of these selectors selected, we're going to scroll down to the input element, and we're going to add an attribute called checked. And this attribute makes a selector checked. However, we don't want all of these delivery options to be checked. We only want it to be checked if it matches the delivery option ID that is saved in the cart. So let's write some code up here to figure out which delivery option should be checked. We're going to create a variable const is checked equals, and we only want it to be checked if this delivery option's ID matches the delivery option ID in the cart. So we'll test if delivery option.id is equal to the cart items dot delivery option ID. Now inside this function, we actually don't have access to cart item. So let's actually pass it in as a parameter. Cart item up here. And then when we call the function, this outer function has access to the cart item. So we're going to give it the cart item. So we're going to put it into this function, and then we can use it down here. So now that we have this variable, instead of being checked all the time, we're going to remove this and insert, and we're going to use a ternary operator here. Is checked question mark and colon. So we can also use a ternary operator when we're inserting into a string. So again, if this is true, it's going to get the value after the question mark. So if it is checked, we're going to give it the value checked. If this is false, we're going to give it the value of empty string. So it's the same thing as if this attribute didn't exist. So now if we save, you'll notice that the correct delivery option is checked for each product. The first product, we saved delivery option 1, and the second product, we saved delivery option 2. Finally, let's replace this date at the top with the delivery date that we selected here. We'll go back to our code, and we'll scroll to the top until we see this date in our code here. So now we're going to calculate this date using the delivery option that we picked. So remember that inside the cart, we only saved the delivery option ID. So let's use this to get the full delivery option. So at the top here, let's get the delivery option ID out of the cart. Const delivery option ID equals cart item dot delivery option ID. Next, we're going to use this ID to find the full delivery option. Now we did something similar with the product ID. We looped through the products, found a matching ID, and then saved it in a variable up here. So we'll do the same thing. Let's create a variable to store the result. Let delivery option, and then we're going to loop through the delivery options. So delivery options dot for each brackets and a function, and let's name the parameter option because we use the name delivery option up here. So in here, we're going to look for a matching ID. So if this option dot ID is equal to the delivery option ID here, we're going to save this inside this variable. So delivery option equals option. So now we have the full delivery option in our code, and we can use it to get the delivery days property and then calculate the day that we need here. To calculate this date, we already wrote some code for this at the bottom. If we scroll down in our code, when we created the delivery options, we calculated the date for each delivery option. So we can reuse this code above. So let's select this code and then right-click, copy, and then at the top, after we get the delivery option, we're just going to right-click and paste that code again. And if we need to, we can reformat by selecting these lines and press Shift-Tab. So this code will take the delivery option that we selected and calculate the delivery date that we need to show down here. And now instead of using the same date every time, we're going to remove this and insert the date string that we created above. So date string and save. So now this date string up here will match the delivery date that we chose on the right side. So that's how we generate the HTML for the delivery options using the day.js external library. So now let's take a look at our changes in Git. We'll go to our code and open the Git section. And here it'll tell us in cart.js, we added delivery option IDs to the cart, as well as when we add to the cart. And then in this file, we created the list of delivery options. And in checkout.js, instead of writing this HTML directly, we generated it. And then in money.js, we learned about default exports. So let's type a message to describe our changes. Save data and generate HTML for delivery options and commit. The last step is to make it interactive. So when we click a delivery option, we need to do two things. First, we need to update the delivery option ID in the cart array. And number two, we need to update the page. So we need to update this date here to match the date that we select. Let's start with the first step. Let's create a function for updating the delivery option in the cart. We're going to go to our code, and we're going to open the file called cart.js. So because we're modifying the cart, a best practice is to put the code inside this file. This file should contain all the code that manages the cart. So we're going to scroll down to the bottom, and we're going to add a new function. So let's type function, and let's name it update delivery option, brackets and curly brackets. So when we update a delivery option, we need to know the product that we want to update, as well as the delivery option that we chose. So we're going to need two things for this function: the product ID and the delivery option ID. So the steps to do this is, first we're going to loop through the cart and find the product. And then we're going to update the delivery option ID of that product. So to find the product using the product ID, we already have some code for this. If we scroll up to the add to cart function, we have this code, which takes a product ID and finds the matching product in the cart. So let's just make a copy of this code. We're going to select it, right-click copy, and then paste it into our new function. So down here, right-click and paste. So this will give us the cart item that matches this product ID and save it in this variable. Next, each cart item has a property called delivery option ID. So we're just going to update that property. So down here, we can just type the code matching item dot delivery option ID and make it equal to the delivery option ID that we give to this function. So delivery option ID. And lastly, because we updated the cart, we should save it to local storage. So we can use this function we created earlier, save to storage, and brackets. Now let's save. Now that we have this function, let's use it on the checkout page. So first let's export it so we can use this in another file. We're going to export this function and save, and then open checkout.js. And then in our project, we need to add event listeners to each of these delivery options, so we run some code when we click them. So inside our code here, we're going to scroll to the HTML for each delivery option, which is right here. And then we're going to add a class so we can select it using the DOM, js-delivery-option. And then we'll add an event listener to these. So we'll scroll down, and down here, we'll add the event listener using document.query selector all brackets and a string. We'll select that class we just created using .js-delivery-option, and then dot for each brackets and a function. So for each option, we're going to add an event listener and listen for clicks. So let's just call each of the options an element. So for each of these elements, we're going to element.add event listener brackets, and we're going to listen for clicks, comma, and we're going to run this function when we click it. So as we said, the first thing we'll do is to update the delivery option ID in the cart. So now let's import that function that we created earlier. We're going to scroll to the top, and we're already importing from the cart. So to import something else, we're going to add a comma, and we're going to import that function update delivery option. So now let's scroll back down and use it in our code. So here, when we click a delivery option, we're going to update delivery option, brackets. Now we said we need to give this function two things: the product ID that we want to update it for, as well as the delivery option ID that we picked. But how do we get these two values? And the answer is, if we scroll up, Here we have access to the product ID, and we also have access to the delivery option ID. So we can use data attributes to attach it to this element here. So let's create a data attribute, data-product-ID equals double quotes, and insert the product ID, which is matching product.id. And we're also going to use a data attribute for the delivery option, data-delivery-option-id equals double quotes. And we're going to insert the delivery option here. So delivery option.id and save. Next, let's scroll back down. And then here, we're going to get those values out of the data attributes by using const. And let's use the shorthand property here for practice. Curly brackets equals the element dot data set. And then out of the data attributes, we're going to get the product ID, comma, as well as the delivery option ID. As a reminder, this is the shorthand property. It does the same thing as the code down here, but it's just a shortcut. Now let's save and try out the project. We'll go back. And here, if we click the second delivery option and then refresh the page, you'll notice that now this one is checked and the date here is correct. So that's how we make this section interactive. We just update the cart, and then when we refresh the page, it will regenerate the HTML based on the new cart. Now let's save our code into Git. We'll go back and open the Git section. And then it will tell us in cart.js, we added this function for updating the delivery option. And in checkout.js, we imported that function. And then at the bottom, we added some event listeners and data attributes, and we use that function to update the cart. Now let's add a message describing our changes. Make delivery options interactive and commit. Next, when we select a delivery option, we need to update the page. So right now in our project, when we click a delivery option, we need to refresh the page for the text to be updated. So what we're going to work on now is when we click this, we want the page to update immediately. So far in this course, the way we solve this problem is once we click this, we're going to use the DOM to get this element here and then update the text directly. However, the problem with this approach is that we need to update the page one by one. And later, there might be lots of places on the page that we need to update. For example, when we change a delivery option, we also need to change the numbers here on the right. So there's potentially a lot of things that we need to update one by one, and it's easy to make a mistake or forget something. So now we're going to learn a better way to update the page. We'll go back to our code, and let's open checkout.js again. And notice, if we scroll up, here, we already have all of this code that takes our data and generates the HTML. So another way to update the page is after we update our data, we just need to rerun all this code and regenerate all this HTML. So let's give this a try. First, we're going to put all of this code inside a function so we can rerun it. We're going to scroll to the top, and let's put this in a function by typing function, and let's call it render order summary, brackets and curly brackets. So the word render just means to display on the page. And we're going to call this section the order summary. So this function should display the order summary on the page. Next, we're going to put all of this code inside our new function. So let's just remove this curly bracket here. And let's actually select all of this code, and we're just going to reformat it by pressing Tab and adding an indent. And then at the end, we're going to add back that closed curly bracket to finish the function. So all we did was we put all of our code inside a function. And then at the bottom, let's run this function because we still need to run all this code at the start of our page. So we're going to type render the order summary and brackets. So this shouldn't change anything because we're just running the same code, but now it's just in a function. Let's save and check. And everything's still working, so that's good. So now let's go back into our code. And this time, to update the page, instead of using the DOM to update the page directly like we did up here, we're just going to rerun all of this code and regenerate all the HTML. So after we update the data, we're going to rerun the code using render order summary and brackets. Now let's save and try it out. So here, let's say we start off with the first delivery option. If we click the third delivery option, you'll notice that the date up here updates automatically. If we click the second delivery option, it updates automatically as well. So that's a better way to keep the page up to date. Instead of using the DOM and changing the HTML directly one by one, we just update the data and then regenerate all of this HTML. So let's go back into our code, and there's two things that I want to point out here. So notice that we put our event listeners into this big function. And that's because when we're regenerating all the HTML, we're essentially deleting the previous HTML and replacing it. So we need to add the event listeners again. And the second thing I want to point out is that inside the render order summary function, we can call render order summary again. So a function can actually call itself or rerun itself. And this feature is called recursion. It's useful when a function needs to rerun all of its code. So now let's save our changes into Git. We'll open the Git section, and it will tell us in checkout.js, we basically moved all of our code into this function. And then at the bottom, we call the function at the start of the page, and we also call the function when we select a delivery option. So now let's add a message describing our changes. Regenerate HTML when updating delivery option and commit. So the technique we just used, where we update the data and then regenerate all the HTML, this technique is called MVC. MVC stands for Model View Controller, and it's a popular technique in software engineering. In MVC, we split our code into three parts. The first part is the model. This is all the code that saves and manages the data. So in our project, all the code in this data folder is called the model because this code saves and manages our data. The second part of MVC is the view. This is code that takes the data and displays it on the page. So in our project, if we open checkout.js and scroll to the top, here we have code that takes our data and then generates all the HTML. So this code is called the view. The last part of MVC is the controller. So this runs some code when we interact with the page. So in our project, at the bottom, these event listeners here would be called the controller because they do something when we interact with the page or with the view. So in MVC, we divide our code into these three parts, and then they interact with each other in a loop. First, we use the model to generate the view. So in our code, that's what we did here. We took the model or the data, which is our cart, and then we generated the HTML or the view. Then, when we interact with the view, it will run the controller. So that's what we did at the bottom here. When we interact with the page, we run some code. Then the controller will update the model. So that's what we did here. Inside the controller, we just updated our data using this function. And finally, we use the updated model to regenerate the view. So that's what this code does. It takes the updated data and then regenerates all the HTML, or regenerates the view. So that's how MVC works. Instead of updating the page directly with the DOM, we just update our data and then regenerate all the HTML. So we use MVC because doing this makes sure that the page always matches the data. So MVC is known as a design pattern. It's a way to organize and design our code. In the future, you might use a technology called a JavaScript framework to build websites. Many JavaScript frameworks are based on MVC, so it's useful to know how it works. Okay, now that we learned the MVC design pattern, let's do some practical examples using MVC. We're going to open our project again to the checkout page, and we're going to create this payment section on the right. Now, before we start, if we look at our code in this checkout.js file, you'll notice that we already have a lot of code here. Instead of adding even more code to this file, let's actually split this up into two different files. So one file will be responsible for this left section, and then one file will be responsible for this right section. We're doing this to keep our code more organized, and so that we don't have too much code in one file. So let's go back, and let's create two new files for the checkout page. So up here, we'll create a file, and let's call this one the order summary.js, and press enter. And let's create another file for the right section, and let's call this one the payment summary.js, and press enter. Now, both of these files are related to the checkout page. So let's create a folder and group them together. We'll create a new folder up here, and let's call it checkout, and press enter. And we're going to move these two files into this new folder. So we'll move that, and we'll move that. Next, let's open checkout.js, and let's move all of this code into the order summary. So we'll press Ctrl A or Command A to select all the code, and then right-click, cut, and then in here, we're going to right-click and paste. Now, there's a few things that we need to fix here. So first, our checkout.html file is still loading checkout.js. So we actually need to run this function inside checkout.js instead of inside here. So let's actually remove this and save. And we're going to scroll to the top. And let's export this function so we can run it inside here. So we'll type export and save. And then inside checkout, we're going to import curly brackets the render order summary function from a string. And to locate this file, we're going to type a // first. That means to start from the current folder, and we'll go into the checkout folder. Checkout/order summary.js. And finally, we're going to run this function when we load the page. So render order summary and brackets, and save. Another thing we need to fix is if we open order summary.js, we moved this file into a folder. So now all of these file paths need to be updated. // is now inside the scripts folder, and we can't find a data folder anymore. So this is going to cause an error. So to find the data folder, we need to get out of the checkout folder, and then we need to get out of the scripts folder. So we need to get out of two folders. So we'll just add an additional //. And then same thing for this. We'll add another ... And for the utils, now we need to get out of the checkout folder and then into the utils folder. So we'll change this to ... utils. And then for here, we're going to go out an additional folder. So another ... and save. So now let's check if this still works. We'll go to our project and refresh and try it out. And the page still works because we're still running all of the same code, but we just organized it into its own file. So now let's open Git and save our changes. So it's going to tell us that in here, we removed all this code, and then we separated it into the order summary file and the payment summary file, which we're going to work on next. So let's type a message describing our changes, move order summary into its own file, and commit. Now let's start creating the payment summary on the right side. So in our code, let's open paymentsummary.js. And just like the order summary, let's put all our code in a function so we can regenerate the HTML if we need to. So we'll type function, and let's call it render payment summary, brackets and curly brackets. And let's just console.log the string payment summary, just to make sure it's working. So we'll save, and let's export this function and then run it inside checkout.js. So export, save, and then in checkout.js, at the top, we're going to import, curly brackets, the render payment summary function from a string, the current folder, go into the checkout folder, and the payment summary.js file. And then at the bottom, we're going to run the function. So render payment summary brackets and save. So let's go back to our project and open the console, right-click, inspect the console, and we'll see the message payment summary. So now we know that our code here is working and the export is working correctly. Now let's remove this code and actually build the payment summary. As always, we're going to do 3 steps. Save the data, generate the HTML, and make it interactive. So let's start with saving the data. In MVC, this is called the model. So if we go to our project, for this section, the data that we need is just to calculate these numbers here. So let's start by calculating this first number here, which is the cost of the products. To calculate this, we can loop through the cart, and for each product in the cart, we can multiply the product's price times the quantity, and then add everything together. Now let's convert these steps into code. We'll go to our project, and inside the payment summary file, first we need to get the cart, so let's import it. Import curly brackets, the cart from the string, and we'll locate cart.js. So first we'll go out of the checkout folder, .. and then go out of the scripts folder, .. and then into the data folder, data/cart.js, and save. And now we're going to loop through the cart. So we can type cart.forEach brackets and a function. And let's name the parameter cart item. So for each cart item, we have the product ID and the quantity. So we need to multiply the product's price times the quantity. So first, we need to use the product ID and get the full product details. And we already have some code for this. Inside ordersummary.js, if we scroll down, here we have some code that takes a product ID and finds the matching product. Now, instead of copy and pasting this code, let's actually put this into a function so we can reuse this, and we'll practice some modules. So let's select this code and right click and copy it first. And then let's go into the products.js file. And at the top, we're going to create a function so we can reuse that code. So let's type function and let's name it getProduct, brackets and curly brackets. And we're going to give this function the product ID that we're looking for. And then let's paste the code we copied earlier. Right click and paste. So this finds the matching product using the product ID. And then at the end of the function, let's return the matching product. So we can use this outside of the function. So now let's export this function so we can share it across files. So export and save. First, we'll go to the order summary. And at the top, let's import that function. So we're already importing from products.js. We're going to import something else using a comma, the getProduct function. And then down here, instead of all this code, we're going to run that function. So we'll make this equal to getProduct and run the function. And we need to give the function the product ID. So let's just give that here, product ID. And because we're no longer updating this variable, we can change from let to const and save. Let's go to our project to make sure everything's still working. So that looks good. And now let's use this function inside paymentsummary.js. So the same thing, we will import curly brackets, the getProduct function from a string, and we'll go to the data folder, // data / and products.js. And let's run that function to get the full product. So get product brackets, and then each cart item has the product ID. So we're going to give it to the function, cart item.product ID. And let's save this product in a variable so we can use it for our calculations. So const product equals getProduct. So now, as we said, we're going to multiply the product's price by the quantity. So down here, we can do product, and it has a property called .price cents, and we're going to multiply it by the cart item, and this has a property .quantity. And the last step is to add all of these together. So outside of the loop, let's create a variable to save the result of adding them together. Let's type let, and we'll name it product price cents equals, and we'll make it 0 to start. And then every time we loop through the cart, we're going to add this to this variable. So we'll type product price cents plus equals this value here. And that's how we calculate the cost of the products. So at the bottom, let's console.log the product price cents, just to make sure that this is working. We'll save, and in our project, we're going to check the console, and it will give us this number here. And this number should match the number on the page, except it's in cents. And assuming you also have 2 socks and 1 basketball in your cart. Okay, so that's how we calculate this first number here. Now let's calculate the second number, which is the cost of shipping. So to calculate this, we're going to loop through the cart and add all the shipping costs together. So let's go into our code. And here, we're already looping through the cart. So instead of creating another loop, let's just calculate the shipping cost in the same loop. So let's create some new lines. And each cart item has a property delivery option ID. So we need to use this ID to get the full delivery option, which has the price. So in the order summary, we also have this code that takes the delivery option ID and finds the full delivery option. So again, let's create a function to share and reuse this code. So first, let's select this code, and we'll right-click and copy. And let's go to the delivery options.js file. And then at the bottom, we'll create a function. Let's call it get delivery option, brackets and curly brackets. And we'll give this function the delivery option ID. And inside here, we'll right click and paste the code that we copied earlier. So this will take this ID and get the delivery option from this array. And let's return this delivery option so we can use it outside of this function. And just to be safe, let's also give this a default value if we don't find a delivery option. So we'll use the default operator or, and let's make the default value the first delivery option. So delivery options square bracket 0. So now let's export this and save. And then inside order summary, we'll use this function. So at the top, we're already importing from delivery options. So we'll type a comma and get delivery option. And then down here, instead of running all this code, we'll select it and make this equal and run the function get delivery option, brackets. And we'll give it this delivery option ID. Delivery option ID. And we can change from let to const, since we're not changing this variable. So now let's save, and let's use this function inside payment summary as well. So in here, at the top, we'll import curly brackets, the get delivery option function, from quotes, the data folder .. .. data/ and the delivery options.js file. And now we'll run this function, get delivery option and brackets. And each cart item has a delivery option ID. So we'll put that into the function, cart item.delivery option ID. And let's save this in a variable, const delivery option equals. And now we can get the price for the delivery option using delivery option dot price cents property. And finally, we're going to add all these together. So at the top, let's create a variable to save the result. Let, we'll call it shipping price cents equals 0. And when we loop through the cart, we're going to do shipping price cents plus equals this delivery options price. And let's also console.log this to make sure it's working. So shipping price cents and save. Now let's go to our project and check the console. And this value here should be the same as adding these two numbers together in cents. So that's how we calculate the second number, the shipping price. So note that this $4.99 number is just a practice number right now. The actual shipping price should be the total of adding all the shipping prices together. The next number we need to calculate is the total before tax. So it's just adding these two numbers together. Inside our code, let's remove these console.logs and we'll create const total before tax cents and make it equal, and we'll add these two together. Product price cents plus shipping price cents. And the next number is the tax. So we're going to calculate a 10% tax on this number here. To calculate 10% of something, we can multiply this by 10 divided by 100. That's what percent means. So 10 divided by 100 is also equal to 0.1. So we can also multiply this number by 0.1. Let's go into our code, and we'll create a variable const tax cents, make it equal to the total before tax cents times 0.1, or 10%. Finally, to calculate the total, we're going to add these two numbers together. So const total cents equals the total before tax cents plus the tax cents. So that's how we calculate all the numbers in the payment summary. And now we have all the data that we need. Next, we're going to generate the HTML. In MVC, this is called the view. So at the bottom here, let's create a variable to store the HTML. Const payment summary HTML. And we'll make it equal to a template string. And then inside here, we're going to copy and paste the HTML. So let's open checkout.html. And we're going to scroll up until we find the class payment-summary. So we're going to generate all the HTML inside here. So let's actually select this HTML and move it into our JavaScript. So we'll select it up until this button, and then we can right-click, cut, and remove the new line, save, and then inside the payment summary, inside the string, we'll right-click and paste the HTML. And if we need to reformat, we can select these lines and press Tab a few times to reformat it. And save. Next, instead of using these same numbers every time, we're going to take the numbers we calculated up here and insert it into this HTML string. So instead of 42.75 every time, we're going to insert the product price cents. And let's give it some new lines to make it a little easier to read. Now remember that this number is in cents, and we want to display it as dollars. To do that, we already have a function for this. So in the utils/money.js file, we have a function format currency that displays it in dollars. So let's use this function inside payment summary. So at the top, let's import the function first. Import curly brackets, the format currency function from a string. And to locate this folder, we'll go out of the checkout folder, // the utils folder /money.js. And then down here, we're going to run the function format currency, open bracket and close bracket. So that's how we insert the product price into this HTML. Let's do the same thing with all of these other numbers here. So this one is the shipping price. So we can insert format currency brackets the shipping price cents. And let's give it some new lines to make it a little easier to read. Next, let's insert the total before tax. So we'll remove this number and insert format currency brackets the total before tax cents and new lines. And next is the tax. We'll remove this and insert format currency brackets the tax cents. And we'll enter some new lines. And finally, the total. So we'll remove this, insert format currency brackets total cents, and add some new lines. And save. Now before we continue, I actually learned of a small issue with the format currency function. So let's open the money.js file. And I recently learned that this toFixed method has a small issue with rounding. So for some numbers that end in 5, it won't round the number properly. One way to fix this issue is to round the price cents first, so that this method doesn't have to do any rounding. So at the front here, let's just type math.round, open bracket and close bracket. So this is just a tricky issue that I discovered with the help of AI recently. We just need to add a little bit of code here to fix it. So now let's save this file and go back to payment summary. So now that we generated all this HTML and inserted our numbers into it, let's put this HTML on the page. So inside checkout.html, let's give this payment summary another class, js-payment-summary. And then we'll select this using the DOM. So now let's save this file. Inside payment summary, at the bottom, after we create the HTML, we're going to document.query selector, brackets and a string, and we'll select .js-payment-summary to get that element. And we'll change the HTML inside that element using .inner capital HTML, and we'll make it equal to the payment summary HTML that we just created. So now let's save and check our project. And now these numbers on the right should match what we have in the cart and the delivery options that we selected. So that's how we generate the HTML for this section here. Now let's save our changes into Git. We'll open Git, and it will tell us in checkout.html, we removed the HTML we created manually. In deliveryoptions.js, we created this shared function for finding the full delivery option, and the same thing in products.js for finding the full product. Inside checkout.js, we're now running all the code inside payment summary. In order summary, we're just using those shared functions that we created. And then in payment summary, we calculated the numbers and generated all the HTML. And finally, in money.js, we fixed a small bug related to rounding. Let's type a message to describe our changes. Save data and generate HTML for payment summary and commit. The last step is to make it interactive. In MVC, this is called the controller. Let's go to our project. And one thing we can make interactive in this section is the place order button. However, we haven't figured out how orders work yet. So we'll work on this in the next lesson. Another thing we can make interactive, however, is when we change the cart on the left, these prices should also update. So let's make this interactive. First, when we delete a product, the prices here should update. So let's actually practice using MVC to create this functionality. According to MVC, when we click delete, we should update the data and then regenerate all of this HTML. So let's get started and go to the code for the delete link. So this is in the order summary section. So in our code, let's open the order summary.js file. And we'll scroll down and find the event listener for the delete link, which is right here. When we click delete, first we're going to update the data. So we already update the data using this function, remove from cart. And now the next step, according to MVC, is to just regenerate all the HTML. So to regenerate the HTML for the payment summary, we created this function at the top, render payment summary. So this will recalculate all the numbers and then regenerate the HTML. So let's import this function. In orderSummary.js, we'll scroll to the top, and down here, we can import curly brackets, the render payment summary function from a string, and we'll locate the payment summary file. So it's in the same folder. So we're going to start with a // which is the current folder, the payment summary.js file. And now let's use this function in the event listener. So let's scroll down. When we click delete, we're going to update the data and then regenerate all the HTML using render payment summary brackets. Now let's save and go to our project. Focus on the numbers on the right here, and now let's click delete. And you'll notice that all of these numbers updated to match our new cart. So that's another example of using MVC. When we click delete, instead of using the DOM to change these numbers one by one, we just update the data and then regenerate all of the HTML. MVC makes sure that the HTML always matches the data, or that the view always matches the model. Let's do one last example of MVC for this lesson. When we change the delivery options here, we also want these numbers on the right to update. So let's find the code for the delivery options. Again, this is in the order summary section. So in our code, we'll open orderSummary.js, scroll down, and then here, we updated the data, and then we're just going to regenerate the HTML for the payment summary using render payment summary and brackets. Now let's save and then look at our project, and let's try changing the delivery option here. And you'll notice the numbers on the right update automatically to match the cart. And that's it. We finished the checkout page. So now let's save our code into Git. We'll go into the Git section here, and inside order summary, we basically imported the render payment summary function, and then at the bottom, we used MVC. So when we click delete, we update the data or the model, and then we regenerate all the HTML or regenerate the view. Down here, same thing. When we click a delivery option, we update the data and then regenerate all the HTML. The last thing we're going to do is at the top of this file, we're going to remove this practice code that we use to learn external libraries. So let's open orderSummary.js. And at the top, we're going to remove this code and save. Now let's go back into Git, and that looks good. Finally, let's type a message describing our changes. Make payment summary interactive and commit. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned about external libraries, which is code that is outside of our project. We learned about the day.js external library, which helps us work with dates. We also learned how to use external libraries with JavaScript modules together, as well as the default export syntax. We created the delivery section of the checkout page. We learned MVC, which is a better way to design our code. And we created the payment section of the checkout page. Thanks for watching this course so far. If you want to support this channel, you can check out the premium version of my courses just like this one, where you can get a certificate of completion and a better learning platform. If you're interested in extra videos from me, more in-depth videos, and behind-the-scenes content, you can check out these links here. You can also support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing this video with others. Thanks again, and let's continue with the course. Here are some exercises to help you practice what we learned in this lesson. In the rest of this course, if you get an error in your project, but your code looks correct, you may have some bad data saved in local storage. To fix this, you can try running localstorage.clear in your console to remove everything from local storage, and then refresh the page. If you see an error like this, object object, that means that you saved something directly into local storage, but you have to JSON.stringify it first. So check your code to make sure that you're always stringifying before saving to local storage, and then clear your local storage and refresh the page. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to test our code. So when we're writing code, it's important to test our code to see if it's working correctly. And if you're working at a company in the future, you'll also be expected to test your code. So let's learn how to do that in this lesson. The easiest way to test our code is to just open the website and try out the code. For example, in our code here, let's open the file utils/money.js. And then inside this file, we have a function called format currency. So let's say we want to test format currency. How do we check if this is working correctly? So as I mentioned, the easiest way to test this is to just open our website and try out this code. So let's open the website. If you don't have the website open, you can right-click checkout.html and then click Open with Live Server. So on this website, we have a couple of prices here, as well as here. And we created these prices using the function format currency. So if we just look at the website, we can see that these prices look correct. And this tells us that the function format currency is working correctly. So that's one way to test that function. We just open the website and try it out. So this is called manual testing, when we manually open the website and try our code. So manual testing is really useful for quickly checking to see if everything is working. So now let's talk about the disadvantages of manual testing. One disadvantage is it's hard to test every situation. For example, here we just happen to have the number 2095 and we test with that. However, what if we want to test with different numbers, like the number 0, or a number that requires rounding, like 2000.5? In order to test all these situations, we have to manually set up our website so that our code runs with those numbers. So here we ran with 2095 as well as 0, so we covered those situations. However, we did not cover 2000.5, so we had to do a bunch of setup in order to test that situation. So as you can see, it takes a lot of time and effort to test different situations in our code. The second disadvantage of manual testing is that it's hard to retest the code. For example, if we change some of our code, how do we retest format currency and make sure that it's still working correctly? Well, we would have to open the website and set up all the situations again and retest all those situations manually. So this takes too much time and effort to retest the code. To solve these two problems, we're going to learn another way to test our code called automated testing. Automated testing basically means using code to test code. Instead of manually opening the website and clicking around to try our code, we're going to tell the computer to do these tests for us. And this will save a lot of time and effort. So let's go ahead and create our first automated test. We're going to go back to our code. And again, let's test this format currency function. To create an automated test, we're just going to write some code to test this function. So first, let's create a folder to group all of our test code together. We're going to click this icon to create a folder. And let's just name this tests and press enter. And we're going to move this folder. So we'll drag it to the top level here beside the HTML files. So we want the test folder to be beside the scripts folder. Next, let's click on the test folder and we're going to create our first test file. We'll click this and we're going to test format currency, which is inside the money.js file. So let's name this file money.test.js. So we know that this file contains tests for money.js. So let's press enter. And inside this file, we're going to write some code to test format currency. So first, let's import format currency so we can test it. At the top, we'll type import curly brackets format currency from a string. And from here, we're going to locate money.js. So we start out in moneytest.js, and we need to get out of the test folder. So we'll type .. to get out of this folder, and then we'll go into the scripts folder, scripts / and then into the utils folder, utils / and locate money.js. So as a reminder, format currency takes a number in cents, like 2,095 cents, and then converts it into dollars, like $20.95. So first, let's test this function using that number 2,095 as an example. We're going to run the function format currency brackets and give it 2,095. And now we're going to check if the result of this function is correct. To do that, we can just use an if statement. So we'll type if, open bracket, close bracket, and we said we expect format currency 2095 to give us the string 20.95. So we're just going to check if this is triple equals to the string 20.95 and curly brackets. And if these two are equal, that means the code is working correctly. So we're going to console.log the string passed to say that this test has passed. Now, if it is not equal to 20.95, we're going to say that this test has failed. So we're going to give it an else curly brackets. And then here, we're going to console.log the string failed and save. And that's it. This is our first automated test. It checks if the result of this function is correct. If it is correct, we're going to display passed. And if it's not correct, we're going to display failed. Now let's run this test code. So remember, we can't run JavaScript files directly. We need to load this JavaScript file using an HTML file. So let's create an HTML file to run this test. Inside the tests folder, we're going to create a new file by clicking up here. And let's name this file tests.html and press enter. And in here, we're going to start by creating a basic HTML structure. So as a reminder, at the top, we'll type ! doc type space HTML greater than, and we'll create an HTML element. And then inside, we'll create a head element as well as a body element. And then inside the body, we're going to create a script tag to run JavaScript code. And we're going to give the script tag an attribute called src or source equals double quotes. And we're going to give it this JavaScript file to run, moneytest.js. And also, because this file uses import, we also need to add an attribute called type equals module to give this file access to JavaScript module features like import. So now let's save, and we're going to run this file in live server. So we're going to click it and then right click, open with live server. And then we're going to check the console by right clicking, inspect, and open the console. And our code displays the text passed. So if we look at our code and open moneytest.js, it's telling us that the result of this function matched what we expected, and this test passed. So that's how we run an automated test. We just load it like normal JavaScript. So as you can see, automated tests are pretty straightforward. We're just using code to test code. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that a disadvantage of manual testing is it's hard to test every situation. Now let's solve this problem using automated tests. So inside moneytest.js, if we want to test format currency in different situations or with different numbers, we can just add some more tests at the bottom. So at the bottom, let's create some new lines, and we'll just add another test using if, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside here, let's test format currency with the number 0. So we'll type format currency, brackets, 0, and we expect this result to be the string 0.00. So we'll check if this triple equals the string 0.00. If this result matches, we're going to console.log the string passed. And if this result does not match, we're going to type else, curly brackets, and console.log the string failed. So that's how we test format currency in a different situation with the number 0. So now let's save and then go back to our test page, which is here, and then open the console, right click, inspect the console, and it will tell us that both of our automated tests passed. So as you can see, automated tests help us test our code in different situations very easily. This is a lot faster than manually opening our website and setting it up to test with different numbers. So let's go back to our code. And by the way, another name for a situation that we're testing is called a test case. So here, instead of saying we're testing 2 different situations, we usually say we're testing 2 test cases. Okay, now let's get more practice and add another test case. At the bottom of this file, we're going to create another if statement, if, brackets, and curly brackets. And this time, let's test format currency, brackets, and we'll give it a number that requires some rounding. So when we calculate the 10% tax on our website, the result could be a decimal, like the number 2000.5. If we use the number 2000.5, this will convert into $20 and 0.5 cents. However, we can't have 0.5 cents, so we're going to round this up to 1 cent. So we're going to have $20 and 1 cent. So let's check if this result triple equals the string 20.01. And if it is equal, we're going to console.log passed. And if it is not equal, else curly brackets console.log failed. And save. And open our test page and open the console. And you can see that all 3 of our test cases passed. And that's it. We just created 3 test cases for format currency using automated tests. Now let's go back to our code. And currently we have 3 test cases. And you might be wondering, how many test cases should we have? Generally, we create 2 types of test cases: basic test cases and edge cases. A basic test case just tests if the code is working or not. So here, our first test case is a basic test case. We use a normal number like 2095, and we see if format currency is working correctly. The second type of test cases that we should have are edge cases. This means we test the code with values that are a little bit tricky. They're on the edge of what our code can handle. For example, in our test here, the last 2 test cases are edge cases. 0 is sort of a special number that's not positive or negative, and 2000.5 is a number that requires some rounding. So these numbers are acceptable. We can use them with format currency, but they're a little bit tricky and on the edge of what our code can handle. So when creating test cases, make sure to create basic test cases as well as edge cases, if there are any edge cases. Now, we could have added another basic test case like format currency 1095. However, this is very similar to 2095. It's basically testing the same thing, so we don't need another test case like this. Generally, we should try to test something different in each test case. For example, an edge case that we have not tested is the number 2000.4. So this would check if the code rounds down correctly to $20.00. However, I'll leave creating this test case as an exercise. Now let's move on and talk about the second disadvantage of manual tests, which is it's hard to retest the code. Automated tests also solve this problem. For example, let's say that we change the format currency function. So inside util/money.js, let's say that we change the code and we remove this rounding code. So we remove math.round and the brackets here. And now after we change this code, how do we check if this code still works correctly? If we were only doing manual testing, we would have to open up the website, set up everything manually, and then click around to see if it's working. However, with automated testing, all we need to do is to rerun all of this test code, and it will instantly retest all of these cases. So let's go back to money.js and save this code, and then go into our test page and check our console. Right-click, inspect the console. And you can see that it instantly reruns all the test cases, and it tells us that the last test case failed. So automated tests make it really easy to retest our code after we make any changes. Okay, now we have another problem here. We can see that the test cases passed, and failed, but it's not clear which ones passed and which ones failed. We don't really have a name for these tests, so we don't know what they're doing. So that's what we're going to add next. We're going to give each of these tests a name. So let's go back to our code and open moneytest.js. And now we're going to give each of these test cases a name. So above the first test case, let's just console.log a string, and we're going to give this test a name. So the name should describe what this test is doing. So in here, let's just use the name converts cents into dollars. And that's how we give the test case a name. Let's do the same thing with the other 2 test cases. So down here, we're going to console.log brackets and a string, and we'll give the second test case a name. So this one tests the number 0. So let's use the name works with 0. So again, the name just describes what the test is doing. And let's do the same thing for the third test case. We'll console.log a string, and here we're testing if the function rounds up to the nearest cent. So let's use the name rounds up to the nearest cent and save. If you're wondering how I came up with these names, a naming convention that we use is to describe what the code is doing. For example, the code works with 0, or the code rounds up to the nearest cent. And then we remove the code. Some people also like to use the word it instead of the code. So now each of these test cases has a name above it. If we open up our test page and open the console, now we can see exactly which test case passed and which test case failed. So this failed test case tells us we have a rounding problem in our code. So now we can go back to our code into money.js and investigate the rounding problem. So of course, we removed math.round as an example. We're just going to add it back to fix that failing test. Capital M math.round, open bracket, and close bracket, and save. And then open the console for our tests, which is here. And now all of our test cases passed. Next, another thing we do when naming our tests is to group related tests together. For example, these 3 test cases are for the format currency function. So we're going to group these tests together and give this group a name. By the way, a group of related tests is called a test suite. So let's go back to our code and open moneytest.js. And at the top, let's give this group of tests or this test suite a name by typing console.log brackets and a string. We're going to name it test suite format currency and save. So now let's open the console for our tests. And now at the top, it will show us test suite format currency. So this makes it clear that this group of tests here are for the format currency function. In the future, if we are testing some other code, for example, a calculated tax function, we can create another group of tests or another test suite like this. And this makes it clear that the second group of tests is for the calculate tax function. So this is how we name our tests and group our tests together to make it more clear what is being tested and which tests have passed or failed. And now we created our first set of automated tests. As you can see, automated tests are basically using code to test code, and they make it really easy to check if our code is working correctly. So now let's save this into Git. We're going to open the Git section, and our first change in moneytest.js, we created the tests for format currency, and then we created an HTML file to load our test code. So let's create a message describing these changes. Create automated tests for format currency and commit. Next, we're going to learn how to use a testing framework to write automated tests. So what is a testing framework? In the previous lesson, we learned about external libraries, which is code that is outside of our project that someone else wrote. And we can load external libraries into our project and use them. So a testing framework is an external library that helps us write tests easier. Let's go back to our code, and we're going to open the moneytest.js file. And notice that in our tests, we need to do several things. First, we create a test suite and we give it a name, and then we create some tests. And for each test, we give it a name. And then we compare the values and display the result in the console. So a testing framework helps us do all of these things automatically and gives us many other features. So now let's learn our first testing framework. In this course, we're going to use a popular testing framework called Jasmine. Now, if you're working at a company in the future, you'll definitely be using a testing framework, but it might not always be Jasmine. And that's okay, because most testing frameworks are pretty similar. So by learning Jasmine, you'll be able to easily use other testing frameworks in the future. To load Jasmine into our project, we're going to go into the video description, and we're going to click this link to download Jasmine. So once that link opens, we're going to be on this page, and we're going to scroll down, and we're going to click this jasmine-standalone.zip file to download it. Now, once that's finished downloading, we're going to open our downloads folder. And if you're on Windows, we're going to right-click the zip file and click Extract All, and click Extract. Now, if you don't have that Extract All option, you can also create a folder with this name and then double-click the zip file and drag everything into that folder. If you're using a Mac, you can just double-click the zip file. So this folder contains the code for Jasmine, and we're going to drag this folder into our project. So let's open the code for our project, and then we're just going to drag this folder down here and click Copy Folder. So just make sure that this folder is beside the scripts and images folder. Next, we're going to rename this folder. So we'll right-click, rename, and let's rename it to tests-jasmine. To make it clear, this folder contains tests created with Jasmine. So now let's press Enter. And now we have Jasmine inside our project. So inside the lib folder, we have some JavaScript files here, and this is the code for the Jasmine testing framework. So this is another way to load an external library into our project. We can just download all the code and put it into our project. And this is useful if an external library has lots of different files like this. Before we continue, let's save these changes into Git. So if we make any changes later, it will be easier to see them. We'll open the Git section, and then we just added all the code for Jasmine. So at the top, let's type the message, add Jasmine testing framework, and commit. Now that we loaded Jasmine into our project, let's learn how to use it. So Jasmine has a documentation page that shows you how to use the testing framework. However, to save time, I'm just going to show you the features that we need, and you can read the documentation later if you want. So first, let's learn how to run tests using Jasmine. I'm going to close this for now, and then in our code, we're going to open the test-jasmine folder, and at the bottom, we're going to open this spec.runner.html file. So this file loads all of the tests. So this does the same thing as our test.html file from before. And by the way, in Jasmine, spec is another name for test. So spec runner just means test runner. This file runs all the tests. So let's actually rename this file to tests.html so we can match what we had before and compare the two. So here we're going to right click and rename tests.html and press enter. And now let's open this file and take a look at the code that's inside. So here at the top, this is the code for the Jasmine testing framework. So we're just loading the framework up here. Below that, here we have the code that we want to test. So this code is sort of like the money.js file that we were testing earlier. And then at the bottom, these files contain the tests. So these files are sort of like the money.test.js file that we had earlier. And you'll notice that these are in a spec folder. So as a reminder, in Jasmine, spec is another name for test. So this is basically the test folder. This folder contains all of our tests. So now let's run these tests. And to do that, we just need to open this HTML file in Live Server, just like we did before. So for this file, we're going to right click and open with Live Server. And I'm just going to make this a little bigger by pressing Control equals, so it's easier to see in the video. So this is what Jasmine tests look like. Up here, we have 5 green dots. This means we have 5 tests that we ran, and the green color means that all of them passed. So down here, each test has a green dot, and you'll notice that each test also has a name next to it, which tells us what the test does. And don't worry if this is in a different order for you. Jasmine randomizes the order of the tests. Also notice that some of these tests are grouped together into a test suite. And up here, we have the name of the test suite. So as you can see, a testing framework helps us do all of the things we were doing before. And it also provides a nice looking website where we can see the test results. So a testing framework is just an external library that helps us write tests easier. Now that we know what Jasmine and a testing framework is, let's learn how to write our tests using Jasmine. First, we're going to go back to our code. And we're going to remove the example code provided by Jasmine. So down here, we'll remove these 4 script tags. And let's also remove the source folder. So we'll right click, delete, as well as the spec folder. Right click, delete. But make sure we keep this lib folder because this contains the code for Jasmine. And now inside test-jasmine, we're going to create a new file for our tests. So we'll create a new file. And let's say that we're testing money.js again. So let's name it the same thing here, money.test.js, and press enter. And now let's create the same tests we had before, but using Jasmine this time. So to make it easier for the video, I'm just going to take this file and drag it to the top here, so we can see these two side by side. So like before, we're going to create tests for format currency. First, we'll need to import this function at the top. So let's just actually select this and right click, copy, and then down here, right click and paste. And just make sure that this file path still works. So our money.test.js file has to be inside tests-jasmine, and this folder should be beside the previous test folder. Next, we're going to create a test suite and name the test suite. So in Jasmine, to create a test suite, we're going to use a function called describe. So this describe function is provided by Jasmine, and it creates a test suite. Next, we're going to give a name to the test suite. So to name a test suite in Jasmine, we're going to give describe a string. And this string is the name of the test suite. So let's name it the same thing as before. Test suite colon format currency. Next, we're going to add some tests inside the test suite. To do that, we're going to give describe a second parameter, which is a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And inside here, we're going to create a test and give the test a name. To create a test in Jasmine, we're going to use another function called it and brackets. So it is another function provided by Jasmine, and this creates a test. Next, let's give a name to our test so that we know what it's doing. To name a test, we're going to give it a string, and this is going to be the test name. So let's name it the same thing we had before. Converts cents into dollars. And now we're going to add some code into our tests. To do that in Jasmine, we're going to give it a second parameter, which is another function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So this is the code inside the test. And in this test, we need to compare these two values and display the result. In Jasmine, instead of creating an if statement and displaying the result ourselves, Jasmine provides us another function to do all of this. And that function is called expect and brackets. So expect lets us compare a value to another value. For example, let's give expect the first value that we want to compare, which is format currency 2095. So we'll type format currency brackets 2095. And now to compare this value to another value, expect gives us an object. And this object has many methods we can use to do comparisons. So one of the methods we can use in this object is dot to equal brackets. And then inside these brackets, we'll put another value that we want to compare this to. So we want to compare this to the string 20.95. And that's it. This checks if this value is equal to this value, and then displays the result on the page. So it does everything that we did before, except with one line of code. And you'll also notice that Jasmine's code is designed so that it reads like English. For example, we expect format currency 2095 to equal this string. And this makes the test code easier to read. So we just created our first test suite and our first test using Jasmine. Now let's run this test. To do that, we just need to run this JavaScript file inside test.html. So first let's save this file. And then inside test.html, we're going to load this file. So in here, at the bottom, we're going to create a script tag. And we'll give it a source attribute, src equals double quotes. And we're going to load moneytest.js. Test.js. And remember, our test file uses import. So we also need to give it the attribute type equals module. So this file has access to JavaScript module features. So now let's save. And we'll open this file in our browser. So we should have it open from before. If you don't, you can right-click and open with Live Server. So we'll open the test page. And now you can see that we have our one test that we created here. And it's passing, so it's green. You can see here that we created a test suite with a name. And we also created a test with this name. So we just created the first test that we had before, except using Jasmine this time. And you can see that Jasmine also creates a nice website for us to see the test results. Okay, now that we learned how to use Jasmine to create a test, let's get some practice and create the rest of our tests from before. We'll go back to our code, and open moneytest.js. And here, we're going to create the other two tests that we had here. So at the bottom, inside the same test suite, we're going to create another test using the function it, brackets, and we'll give it a string, which is the test name, and let's name it the same as before. Works with 0, comma, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And now we can put something inside this test. So inside the second test, we're going to compare these two values. To compare values, we're going to use the function expect, brackets, and the first value is going to be format currency, brackets 0. And then expect gives us an object. And this object has a method called .toEqual, which lets us compare this value to another value. So we'll call this method using brackets and compare it to this string, the string 0.00. And now let's save, and Live Server will update our web page automatically. So we'll open the test page, and now we have two tests, and they both passed. So that's how we create the second test using Jasmine. And again, don't worry if this is in a different order for you. Jasmine randomizes the order of the tests. Finally, let's create that third test that we had before. We'll go back to our code, and then in our old money test file, we're going to create this third test. Feel free to pause the video if you want to give it a try yourself. So we'll scroll down, and we'll create another test inside this test suite using the function it, brackets, and a string, and we'll give it the same test name as before. Rounds up to the nearest cent, comma, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And we're going to compare these two values. So we use expect, brackets, and give it the first value, format currency, brackets 2000.5, and to compare it, we'll use the method .toEqual, brackets, and compare it to 20.01, and save. And let's go back to our test page, and now we have 3 tests, and all 3 of them passed. So we recreated the tests that we had before. Now let's try making one of these tests fail to see what it looks like in Jasmine. We'll open our code, and let's open the file utils/money.js. And just like before, let's try removing this math.round function and remove the brackets here to make one of the tests fail. So we'll save, and then open our test page. And now it will tell us that one of our tests failed. And here it will show us the details of the failing test. So it tells us the test suite name and the test name that failed. And it will also tell us the two values that are not equal to each other. And here it will tell us where this test failed. So it will tell us that it failed in moneytest.js at line 13. So if we go back to our code, and we open the Jasmine moneytest.js, line 13 is right here. So it's just telling us that this line failed the test. Here, we can see the full list of tests, and it will tell us that we have 3 tests, 2 of them passed, and 1 of them failed. So Jasmine gives us a lot of details on where a test failed to help us fix the issue. Now let's add back math.round to make everything pass again. We'll open our code and open utils/money.js, and we'll just add back capital M math.round, open bracket and close bracket, and save. And if we check our test page, everything passes again. So this is how we use a testing framework like Jasmine to create tests. The testing framework gives us a bunch of functions, such as describe, it, and expect. And then we use these functions to create our tests. So these functions have a lot of features inside them. They do all of the setup for us, and they also display the tests on a nice web page for us. Now, there's one more thing I want to mention, which is we can use describe inside describe. This helps us organize our tests further. So now let's save our changes into Git. We'll open the Git section, and let's close this file at the top for now. So inside moneytest.js, we created all the tests that we had before for format currency, but using Jasmine this time. And for spec runner, we renamed this file to test.html. And finally, we deleted all the test code that came with Jasmine. So now let's add a message to describe our changes. Remove default tests and add money tests and commit. Now let's test a different function using Jasmine. And along the way, we're going to learn some more features of testing frameworks. Let's go back to our code. And we're going to scroll to the top and open the data/cart.js file. So inside this file, we have a function called add to cart. So we're going to create tests for the add to cart function. First, since this function is in a different file, we're going to create a new test file. So we're going to scroll down and let's close the test folder so we don't get confused. And then inside test-jasmine, we're going to click in this folder and then create a new file. And let's name it cart-test.js and press enter. So we name it the original file name, which is cart, and then just add test at the end. And to better organize our test files, we usually try to match the folder structure of the code. So for example, in our code, money.js is inside this utils folder. So inside our tests, we should also create a utils folder and put this file inside. So we'll create a new folder by clicking up here, and let's name it utils and press enter, and then move the moneytest.js file inside. If it asks you if you want to update imports automatically, you can click yes. If you check your code, scroll to the top, make sure that your file path starts with .. because now we're inside another folder. VS Code sometimes updates the file paths for us automatically, but if it doesn't, we can just add an extra .. in front ourselves. And we're also going to open moneytest.js and save this file. Next, if we scroll up, cart.js is inside a data folder. So inside our tests, we're also going to create a data folder. Let's click cart-test.js. We'll create a new folder, and let's name this the data folder and press enter. And then move cart-test.js inside here. Now, you'll notice that this folder structure doesn't perfectly match the folder structure that we have up here, because utils is inside the scripts folder. But usually this data folder should also be inside the scripts folder. I just made a mistake when structuring the project. So let's just use this folder structure in our tests. Okay, so now let's open cart-test.js, and now we're ready to test the add to cart function. So first, let's import add to cart at the top. We'll import curly brackets add to cart from a string, and we're going to locate cart.js. So first, we need to get out of the data folder using .. and then get out of the test-jasmine folder .. and we'll go into this data folder data/cart.js. Next, let's create a test suite for this function. So we'll create some new lines. And to create a test suite in Jasmine, we'll use the function describe, brackets, and we'll give this test suite a name by giving it a string. So let's use the name test suite : add to cart. And we'll give it a second parameter, which is a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And now inside this test suite, we're going to add some tests. So let's look at the code for add to cart to see what kind of tests we should add. So we'll open data/cart.js. And then inside add to cart, you'll notice that this function uses an if statement. A best practice in testing is to test each condition of the if statement. This is known as test coverage. Test coverage means how much of the code is being tested. And a best practice is we try to maximize test coverage. So for this if statement, we'll create a test for the first condition, which is when the product is already in the cart, and we'll create a test for the else condition, when the product is not in the cart. Let's go back to carttest.js. And inside this test suite, we're going to create a test using the function it, brackets, and we'll give it a string. And this will be the test name. So for the video, I'm just going to scroll up and take this cart.js file and put it at the top here, so we can see our code and our tests side by side. So I'm going to scroll down to the add to cart function. And we mentioned that we're going to test each condition of this if statement. So the first test is going to be when the product is already in the cart. So down here, let's name it adds an existing product to the cart, comma, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And let's add another test for when the product is not in the cart, so this else condition. So down here, we'll create another test using it, brackets, and a string, and the test name adds a new product to the cart, comma, and a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So these are the two tests that we need for the two conditions of this if statement. Let's actually start with adding a new product to the cart, since it's a little easier to test. Now, unlike the format currency function, add to cart doesn't return a value, so we can't really compare it to another value using expect. Instead, we're going to call add to cart to modify the cart, and then check if this cart looks correct. To do that, inside here, let's call the function add to cart, brackets. And this function takes one string, which is the product ID. So inside here, let's give it a string. And to find a product ID that we can test with, we're going to go to the left and scroll up. And we're going to open the data/products.js file. And inside here, we have a list of products. So let's just take the first product ID and use it in our test. We're going to select this ID and right-click, copy, and then inside carttest.js, in this string, we're going to right-click and paste. So this will add this product ID to the cart. And now to check if this code is working correctly, we're going to check what the cart looks like. So first we need to import the cart. We're going to scroll up, and since we're already importing from cart.js, to import the cart, we can type a comma, cart. And then at the bottom here, we're going to create a new line. And first, let's check if the cart.length is correct. So if we assume that we start with an empty cart, when we add a product, the cart.length should be 1. So we can compare these two values, cart.length and 1. So to compare values, we're going to use the function expect brackets, and we'll compare the cart.length. And then here we'll use the method .to equal brackets 1. So now let's save this file, and we're going to run these tests. To run them, we're just going to load this file inside test.html. So we'll open this, and then at the bottom, we'll create a script tag, give it a source attribute, double quotes, and we're going to load this file. So this file is inside the data folder. So we need to type data / to go into the folder, and then load cart test.js. And this file also uses import. So we're going to give it the attribute type equals module to enable JavaScript module features. And one thing that I forgot to do is we moved money test into the utils folder. So we need to update the source attribute to add the utils folder, and then / to go into the folder, and then locate moneytest.js. So now let's save this HTML file and open this test page in our browser. And now we should have 2 additional tests, and the test that we just created should fail. If it doesn't fail for you, you can go into your console and run localstorage.clear, and then refresh the page, and it should fail. So this tells us that the failure happened in the test suite add to cart. In the test, adds a new product to the cart, which is the one we just created. So it's telling us that the cart.length is not equal to 1. It's equal to a different number. So why is this happening? Let's go back to our test, open cart.test.js, and in here, remember that we assumed the cart starts as empty, and if we add a product, the cart.length would be 1. However, the cart doesn't actually start as empty. In cart.js at the top here, we're loading the cart from local storage. If there's nothing in local storage, we use this default cart. So our starting cart depends on what's inside local storage. And this is a big problem when testing, because local storage can change. If there's an empty cart saved in local storage, our test will pass. But if there's not an empty cart in local storage, then this test will fail. This is known as a flaky test, a test that sometimes passes and sometimes fails, even if we don't change the code. Now, to solve this problem, we're going to use a feature of Jasmine called mocks. A mock lets us replace a method with a fake version, and then we can make the fake version do anything we want. For example, when we load the cart from local storage, we're using local storage.getItem. So we can use a mock to create a fake version of getItem. And then we can make this fake version do anything we want, like return an empty array. So let's go ahead and create our first mock. We'll go back to carttest.js, and at the top of this test, we're going to create a mock using another function of Jasmine called spy on and brackets. And we'll give spy on 2 parameters. The first parameter is the object that we want to mock. In our case, it's local storage. So we'll type local storage, comma, and then we'll give it a string. And this string will be the method that we want to mock. In our case, we want to mock the getItem method. So here we'll type getItem. And make sure I is uppercase so that we exactly match the method name. So now this will replace local storage.getItem with a fake version. And we can make this fake version do anything we want. To do that, spy on gives us an object. And this object has a property we can use. So at the end, we'll type dot and the property called and. And this result is also an object. And this object has a method called dot call fake brackets. So don't worry about all the dots here. Jasmine just organizes its code so that it reads like English. So we're spying on local storage.getItem and call fake. So next we're going to give call fake a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And this function is what we want getItem to do. So we're essentially overriding the original getItem with whatever is inside this function. So earlier, we said we wanted getItem to return the empty array for this test. So inside this fake function, let's make getItem return the empty array. Now remember that local storage only supports strings, so we need to return this as a string. To do that, we're going to use the code JSON, all uppercase, dot stringify, open bracket, and close bracket. So this will convert whatever's in the brackets to a JSON string. And that's what we need for local storage. So now let's test out this mock to see if it works. Below this, we're going to console.log brackets and run local storage.get capital I item brackets the string cart. Let's save this file and then open the test page in our browser. And we're going to open the console. So right click, inspect, and the console. And you'll see that here, local storage.getItem is no longer loading from the actual local storage. It's giving us an empty array every time. So now we have mocked the getItem method. However, you'll also notice that our test is still failing. So how come it still fails? To understand what's happening, let's take a closer look at our code. We'll go back to our code. And inside our tests, here we're mocking local storage.getItem. But notice that above this, if we scroll up, we import the cart at the top. So the order of this code matters. First, we load the cart from local storage, and after we're mocking local storage.getItem. So the cart is already loaded at this point, and this code doesn't have the effect that we want. So one way to solve this problem is after we mock local storage here, we should reload the cart. So inside cart.js, just gonna give it a little more space. To reload this cart after we mock, we just need to rerun all of this code. So let's create a function so we can rerun this code. At the bottom here, we'll create a function and we'll call it load from storage, brackets and curly brackets. And we're just going to move all of this code inside the function. So let's select all the code up to cart equals. We'll right click, cut, and then in the function, we'll right click and paste. And at the top, let's create the cart variable again. Let cart and semicolon. And lastly, when we load this file, we need to run this function so that we run this code at least once. So down here, we'll just run this function, load from storage and brackets. So let's save. So we're basically running the exact same code as before, except this code is now inside a function. And now in our tests, after we mock local storage.getItem, we're going to reload the cart using this function. So first let's export it so we can use it in our tests. We'll type export and save this file. And inside our tests, let's scroll up to the top. We're already importing from cart.js. So we'll type a comma and we'll import load from storage. And then we'll scroll down back to our tests. And here, after we mock local storage.getItem, we're going to load from storage, brackets, and save. So this time, we mock local storage.getItem first to return an empty array. And then when we reload the cart, this is going to be an empty array, and the cart will be empty. And now in our tests, when we add a product to an empty cart, the cart length will be equal to 1. So this test will pass. So we can actually remove the console.log here and save and check our test page. And now this test should be passing. Next, let's go back to our code. And if we look at the add to cart function in cart.js, so in here, at the bottom of this function, you'll notice that we're saving the cart to local storage. So this is going to call local storage.setItem. However, we don't actually want to save to local storage because this is just test code. We don't want our test code to be modifying local storage or affecting our real code. To prevent this, we're also going to mock local storage.setItem. So down here, we're going to create some new lines at the top of the test, and we're going to mock local storage.setItem using the function spy on brackets, and we'll give it local storage, comma, a string, and the method we want to mock, which is set item, and save. And remember, the order of the code matters. So we want to mock local storage.setItem first, and then we call add to cart. So now setItem will be replaced with a fake version, and this will no longer save to local storage. Next, spy-on has another useful feature, which is it records every time a method is used. For example, what if we want to make sure that add to cart saves the cart to local storage at the end? In our tests, setItem is mocked, so we can't really check what's inside the local storage. Instead, we can just check if add to cart calls setItem at some point. To check if setItem was called, at the bottom, we can use the function expect, brackets, and we're going to give this the method that we mocked, which is local storage.setItem. And remember that expect gives us an object, and this object has many useful methods to check stuff, like dot to equal. So another method we get from expect is dot to have been called times, brackets. So make sure that you write this method in camel case. To is lowercase, and every word after starts with a capital. So this method checks how many times local storage.setItem was called in the code above. So we expect it to be called once inside add to cart. So we're going to give it the number 1. So keep in mind that this only works if this method has been mocked with spy on. So now let's save and open our test page. And you can see that all of our tests passed. And local storage.setItem was called once. So after we mock a method, we can check how many times this method was called. And we can even check what values this method received, but I'll leave that as an exercise. Another thing you'll notice here is that each test can have multiple expectations, and the test will only pass if all of its expectations pass. Now let's add a few more expectations to this test for practice. So one thing we can check is we can check the first product in the cart and make sure that its product ID matches this string here. So below this, let's use another expect brackets, and we're going to check the first product in the cart using cart square bracket 0. So this is going to be an object, and this object is going to have a property called product ID. So down here, we'll get the dot product ID. And we're going to check if this product ID is equal to this string. So to do that, we'll use the dot to equal method, brackets, and we'll give it this string here. So let's just select this and right click, copy, and here, right click and paste. Another thing that we can check is the quantity. When we add a new product to the cart, the quantity should start out as 1. So down here, we're going to add another expect brackets, and we're going to check the first product, cart square bracket 0 dot quantity dot to equal brackets 1 and save. Now let's open our test page, and you can see that all of those expectations passed. Now let's move on and create the test for adding an existing product to the cart. So we'll go back to our code and scroll up to the first test here. So first, we need to set up the cart so that it already contains the product that we want to add. To do that, we're going to mock local storage.getItem again. So down here, we can just reuse this code. So we're going to select this code and right click, copy, and then in the first test here, right click and paste. And this time, to set up the test, we're going to put a product into the cart at the beginning. And then we're going to add the same product to the cart. So inside this cart array, let's add an object. And each product has a property called product ID. So we're going to add this property, product ID colon, and let's just give the same product ID that we used down here. So we'll select this and then right click, copy, and then up here, we're going to right click and paste, comma, and each product also has a quantity. So we'll give it a quantity, colon, and let's just give it 1, comma, and also a delivery option. So delivery option ID, colon, and let's just give it the string 1 and save. So now when we do local storage.getItem, it will give back this array as the starting cart. And then we need to make sure that we reload the cart from storage. Next, let's scroll down and let's copy the rest of the test because it's going to be very similar. So we're going to select this code and right click, copy, and then up here, create some new lines and right click and paste. And also one thing I forgot to copy over is to mock local storage.setItem. So at the top, let's also spy on brackets, local storage, comma, a string, set item. So a mock only lasts for one test. Once that test is finished, the method is no longer mocked. So that's why in this test, we also have to mock local storage.setItem. And now in this test, we're just going to modify these expectations so that they make sense for this test. If we add an existing product to the cart, the cart.length will still equal 1 because these product IDs match, and we're just increasing the quantity. We're still going to call local storage.setItem once, so this is correct still. The first item in the cart is going to have this product ID, and the only thing we're going to change is that the quantity is now going to increase by 1. So it's going to go from 1 to 2 this time. So everything is the same, except if we add an existing product, we're just increasing the quantity. Now let's save and check the test page. And now the existing product test is passing. And that's it. We created tests for the add to cart function. So now let's do some cleanup. And we're actually going to remove everything from local storage since we were modifying it earlier in the test and we might have messed it up. So on this page, we're going to right click, inspect, and open the console. And to remove everything from local storage, we're going to type the code local capital S storage dot clear and brackets and press enter. And then we'll refresh the page. Now finally, let's go into Git and save our changes. So we'll open our code and we can close this one for now. And we'll open the Git section. So in cart.js, at the top, we basically put all the code that loads the cart into a function so we can use it in our tests. And then here we moved moneytest.js into a utils folder. In test.html, we're loading the new cart.test.js file. And then inside cart.test.js, we added some tests for the add to cart function. So now let's create a message describing these changes. Create automated tests for add to cart and commit. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson is how to create more complicated tests. So far, we've only been testing a single function. For example, we tested the add to cart function as well as the format currency function. So these are called unit tests because we're only testing one unit or one piece of the code. Now, what if we want to test a whole page or part of a page? This requires a more complicated test called an integration test. An integration test tests many units of code or pieces of code working together. For example, in our code, we're going to go to scripts/checkout/the order summary.js file. And we're going to test this render order summary function. So this function creates a whole section on the checkout page. And it uses many different functions and libraries to create the page. So testing this function will be considered an integration test because it uses many different pieces of code or units of code together. So let's start by creating a test file for this function. So this is in the order summary.js file. Inside our test here, let's match the file structure that we have here. So we're going to click test-jasmine. First, we're going to create a checkout folder. So we'll click here to create a folder. And we're going to name it checkout and press enter. And then inside the checkout folder, we're going to create a new file. So we'll click this to create a new file. And we'll name it the same as above, order summary, and add test.js and press enter. So by matching the file structure, it's clear that this test file is going to test order summary.js. And again, for the video, I'm just going to drag this file to the top here. So we can see this and the test side by side. And now we're going to test this render order summary function. So first we're going to import this function into our test file. So at the top, we'll import curly brackets, the render order summary function from a string, and we're going to locate this file. So first we need to get out of the checkout folder and out of the test-jasmine folder. So we'll use 2 .. And then we're going to go into the scripts folder and into the checkout folder, scripts slash checkout slash, and we'll load order summary.js. We'll create some new lines, and let's start by creating a test suite using the function describe brackets. And inside we'll give it a string, and we'll name this test suite test suite colon render order summary, a comma and a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And now, what test cases should we create? Render order summary creates a part of the page. So when we're testing a page, the two things we need to test is how the page looks and how the page behaves. Let's start by testing how the page looks. Inside our test suite, we're going to create a test using it, brackets, and we'll name this test with a string. And this will just be a basic test case. So we'll describe what this function does, which is displays the cart, comma, and we'll give it a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And now we're ready to create the test. So render order summary usually displays the cart on the page. However, in our tests, where does this cart get displayed? So if we look at the code in this function and we scroll down, here we generate the HTML for the cart. And then after we generate the HTML, we put the HTML inside an element with the class js-order-summary. However, we don't have this element in our tests. So to fix this, we're just going to create an element with the class js-order-summary. To do this, we're going to scroll down and we're going to open the test.html file. And then at the bottom, we're going to go to the body, and then inside here, we're going to create a div. So less than, div, and greater than. So remember how we said we need to create an element with the class js-order-summary? We're going to create that element and put it inside this div. So this div is going to act like a container. The reason we use a container is that when we create elements in our test, we don't want to be modifying the entire body because the body might contain our test results from Jasmine. So we put everything inside a container. So now let's give this div a class so we can use it in our JavaScript. We're going to give it a class equals double quotes, and we're going to call this the js-test-container. To make it clear, this is a container for all of our test code. And save. And now let's get this container into our tests. We can do that using document.querySelector, brackets, and a string, and we'll select the class using a .js-test-container. And then inside this container, we're going to create an element with the class js-order-summary. So to put something inside this element, we're going to use the property .inner capital HTML equals a template string. And inside this template string, let's create a div element, less than div greater than, less than slash div greater than. And as we mentioned, we'll give this element a class equals double quotes of js-order-summary. So this basically takes this HTML and puts it inside our test container. So it will put it inside here. And now we have the element that we need for render order summary. So when we call this function, it's going to create the cart and display it in this element here. Next, if we look at the code for render order summary and we scroll to the top, you'll notice that it takes the cart and then displays it on the page. But remember that by default, we load this cart from local storage, and this can cause problems in our test, depending on what is inside local storage. So to fix this, we're going to mock local storage.getItem again to control exactly what's inside this cart. So let's actually open the cart test that we had before, and we're just going to copy paste this mock that we created. So we're going to start from here, this function, and we're going to select the code up to spy on get item, and then right click, copy, and then down here, we're going to right click and paste. And one other thing we need to do here is we don't have access to load from storage right now. So we need to import it. At the top, let's also copy the import that we had here. So we're going to select this and then right click, copy. And then down here, we're going to right click and paste the import. And we just need to make sure that this file path locates cart.js. So .. It's going to go outside checkout and outside test-jasmine. And then it will go inside the data folder and then locate cart.js. So this file path is correct. And currently we're not using these two values, so we can just remove them. And now let's set up this cart for this test. So we could just use this cart here. However, to make our test a little more detailed, let's open the cart.js file. And at the top here, we're going to use this default cart instead because it has two products with different quantities. So we can test more things. So we're just going to select this cart here and then right click, copy, and then down here, open order summary test. And we're going to select this cart and remove it. And inside these brackets, we're going to right click and paste that default cart. And now that the HTML and the cart is set up for this function, at the bottom, we can call the function render order summary and brackets and save. So now let's run this test file. We're going to open test.html, and then